What you're going to see is a demonstration of cognitive processing therapy, or CPT. I'd like to first begin with a little background on cognitive processing therapy as well as the client. A traumatic experience can send your life into a tailspin. It can alter your thinking, causing you to view yourself and the world around you in a totally new way. You may begin to view the world as unsafe. Completing normal daily activities triggers a sense of danger. The experience may lead to perceptions of inadequacy or thoughts of being unable to control your life. When this negative way of thinking develops, it interferes in the recovery process. The individual gets stuck, unable to move past these thoughts or the place that the thoughts have taken them. This type of reaction to a traumatic event is quite common in individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Cognitive processing therapy is an evidence-based intervention often used with individuals exposed to military-related trauma and subsequently diagnosed with PTSD. It is founded upon principles of social cognitive theory and is proven to be effective in addressing the individual's stuck points, helping them to challenge or change them. Stuck points develop when an individual's interpretation of the trauma, along with the maladaptive coping strategies, interfere with daily living. Cognitions are distorted, assumptions are made, and there is a struggle to make meaning of the traumatic experience. Cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, is a 12-session therapy which is very manualized. The therapist is provided with the topic and activities or homework assignments for each session. Potential issues that may be encountered are also outlined for the therapist. And now a little background on the client. The client, Miss Susan, received a diagnosis of PTSD and major depression, and she is receiving cognitive processing therapy. She is meeting her therapist for session number 5. Ms. Susan has already been educated about PTSD and has written an impact statement during sessions 1 through 4. The statement is helping the client, with assistance from the therapist, to identify areas of faulty or problematic thinking. Ms. Susan is currently serving in the United States Air Force as a medical technician. She had previously sought help from her on-base mental health provider after having suicidal ideations. In her initial assessment, Ms. Susan disclosed that she was deployed to Syria in 2017, where she worked in the medical station for wounded airmen and soldiers. Ms. Susan stated that when she returned home to the States, she was excited to get back to her family and friends. Several months following her return, Ms. Susan began to experience anxiety attacks whenever she would hear or see something that reminded her of the medical station in Syria. There was one specific event that troubled her. Her team was unable to save a young man who she had recognized from her duty station in Texas. Subsequently, Ms. Susan began to struggle performing at work due to these attacks, and eventually she was moved to an administrative position in the medical unit due to the drop in her performance. Ms. Susan reported being unable to sleep at night and often having nightmares about her experiences in Syria. Though she is typically a very social person, she began to withdraw from her family and friends. This was done out of embarrassment of her symptoms and as an attempt to avoid triggers. Ms. Susan is feeling extremely depressed and lonely. She is also suffering from migraine-like headaches. In this session, session 5, the therapist and client will review the session 4 practice assignment. At the end of session 4, the client was introduced or instructed to rewrite her trauma account, adding specific points she may have omitted from the first trauma account, adding additional sensory or emotional details, and also thoughts and feelings during the incident as well as current thoughts and feelings. Ms. Susan will continue to be taught how to label her thoughts and acknowledge the relationship between them. Socratic questioning will be used by the therapist to challenge the client's distorted cognitions. One goal is to address areas of self-blame with the hope that the client will begin to use this term less frequently. The challenging questions worksheet will also be introduced to confront stuck points, those negative beliefs that lead to maladaptive behaviors. Susan, I just want to thank you for reading your second trauma account. You seem to have written more about the moment you recognized Joe's face as he lay on the gurney. What are your feelings about that at this very moment?
Regret.
Has your feeling of regret diminished, or is it stronger now than when you first wrote about it?
I think it's stronger now.
Why do you think that's so?
I'm not sure, but as I wrote about the incident and thought about it more, I really started to regret not just being unable to save Joe's life, but even being assigned to the medical unit in the first place.
If you weren't part of the medical team that treated Joe, do you think he would have survived his injuries?
Well, no, but Joe's injuries were pretty severe. No matter how skilled the medical staff was, they probably couldn't have saved him.
They probably couldn't have saved Joe. So your presence made the difference?
Sometimes I just feel like maybe if someone else was in my place, another medical technician, I know it's not my fault, but then again,
One thing we want to do is to get you to that point where you can talk about Joe's death or think about it without a ton of negative emotions. No regret, no self-blame, and no guilt. Over the remaining sessions, I'm going to provide you with some tools to help you work through these stuck points. As we've discussed in previous sessions, these stuck points hinder your ability to make meaning of the trauma you've experienced and ultimately heal from it. Let's take a look at the challenging questions worksheet. So, tell me one belief you have that's associated with how you view the incident involving Joe.
my belief is that I wasn't ready when the medics brought Joe into the medical station. I slowed us down.
What evidence have you identified to support the belief that you weren't prepared?
I just froze. When I recognized Joe as they brought him in, when I realized that he was from my duty station in Texas, it seemed like I couldn't move.
And what evidence can you identify that does not support the belief that you weren't ready?
Well, when I thought about it, I realized that I responded immediately when I was called over by the nurse. And I had all the supplies in order, and I was able to follow instructions.
Okay. So do you think that your beliefs are based on habit or fact?
Well, I've been told that I have a tendency to be very critical of myself. It might be a habit to blame myself.
Well, let's look at that for a moment. You mentioned the word blame. Did you intend to cause Joe's death or bring him
No,
harm in any way?
no, not at all.
Blame is associated with intentionality. So if you didn't intend to harm Joe, using the word blame is not accurate. As you previously stated, you were prepared to handle medical emergencies. In the case of Joe, the outcome was simply out of your control.
Well, I follow what you're saying. I guess I'm just so used to finding fault with myself when things don't go right.
Let's take a look at the third question. Are your interpretations of the situation too far removed from reality to be accurate?
I'm not sure of the meaning of the question.
Well, that's okay. Sometimes this question is misunderstood. But it's just asking you to consider what you knew at the time that Joe came into the medical station and what could you have realistically done differently.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me think. We knew that he was critically injured and unconscious, but I guess that realistically, I could not have been any more prepared. There were no other supplies that I could have had available. It happened so quickly.
Okay. Are you thinking in all or none terms?
Oh, that could be. I am thinking that because I became motionless when they first brought Joe in, that moment caused everything that followed to go wrong.
Are you using any words or phrases that are exaggerated or extreme when you're thinking about the incident? For instance, words like always or never or must or should.
Whenever I think about it, I think that I should have been able to handle it. I should not have frozen up, not even for an instant when I saw him.
Do you think that it's more likely that a person would, stop and take a moment to process the fact that someone they know is in a life or death situation? Or do you think that they would not take notice of this at all?
Yeah, I guess they might need a moment to process it. Yeah, I think
So how is stuck point confusing the possibility of something happening with the likelihood that it would happen?
Okay, well, my stuck point is that I think that I should have been more prepared and I should not have, become paralyzed the moment I recognized Joe. I guess I'm so stuck on this idea that I should not have frozen that I'm expecting myself to respond differently to the situation than most people probably would.
Okay. It seems to me like your stuck point isn't quite as stuck as it was before.
Yes, I'm beginning to look at this a little differently. Yeah.
Mm. The next question asks if you are taking a situation out of context and maybe focusing on one aspect of the event.
I realize that I've just been focusing on the first moment that I froze, and I'm still wondering if that moment could have prevented his death.
Do you think the source of information you had is reliable?
Well, I am the main source of the information. No one else seems to think that we could have saved him.
Are you confusing a low probability with a high probability?
It's hard to tell because seconds can make a big difference when it comes to medical emergencies.
That's true. What about your judgments? Are they based on feelings rather than facts?
Well, I have no real facts to back up this belief, but I have feelings of guilt and regret. I'm not sure how much those feelings are connected to the fact that I knew him.
Well, there is certainly a relationship between our thoughts and relevant facts associated with a traumatic situation. And we'll be sure to explore this further. Are you focused on irrelevant factors?
Irrelevant factors. Well, maybe I'm too focused on that moment that I froze. There are many other things that could have contributed to the situation. We were understaffed and the blood supply was limited. So,
So it sounds like your perception of the situation is changing. Did you find that filling out this worksheet was helpful?
Yes, I'm still, a little stuck on the belief that I shouldn't have froze, but I'm not so sure anymore that it would have made any difference for Joe. I feel like I shouldn't be freezing now either. Like when I see something, that reminds me of the medical station, but it is happening.
Okay. So when we use the phrase should and never, we're talking in extremes, which are usually not supported with facts, just like we explored earlier in this worksheet.
It's hard to change those thoughts, isn't it?
It can be. That's why it's so important to use these tools. These types of worksheets are very, very important in this process. It brings awareness to our thought patterns and emotional responses. For instance, do you see your feelings as proof that something is real?
Well, I don't think that we should ignore our feelings, but I know that we need to back it up with facts. I feel guilty about Joe's death, but I'm not sure that my guilt is proof that I did anything to cause the death.
I'm glad to hear that there's some changes in your cognition as it relates to this incident. So, Susan, our time is almost up now. So let's go over your practice assignment before we end the session. So each day between now and session 6, I'd like you to complete the challenging questions worksheet, choosing one step point each day. Over time, we'll be able to identify any patterns of thinking you might be using that are not beneficial to you and need to be addressed. I think we've covered ground today. What are your thoughts about the challenging questions worksheet and our session?
Well, I feel like I'm beginning to process all of this. Uh, when you actually use a worksheet, you can see how mixed up your thoughts can get about things. I feel tired from all of this, but I also feel a little lighter. Um, I'm actually looking forward to our next session.
Well, that's great, Susan. I'm looking forward to it as well. I'll see you next week.
See you next week.